Welcome to Indigenous Love Stories. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's begin today's story. The wind carried death across the Montana plains that October evening, howling through the skeletal remains of burnt cottonwoods like the voices of forgotten spirits. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, their bellies swollen with the promise of an early winter that would claim the weak and unprepared. The air itself seemed to thicken with foreboding, pressing down upon the isolated homestead where lamplight flickered behind frost-covered windows. Thomas Whitmore stood on his porch, weathered hands gripping the wooden railing as he watched the approaching tempest. His ranch, once prosperous with cattle and hope, now bore the scars of recent tragedy. The barn doors hung askew on broken hinges, and the corrals stood empty save for the wind that whistled through the gaps in the fencing. 3 months had passed since the fever took his wife, leaving him alone with his 17-year-old daughter, Sarah, whose delicate constitution had never fully recovered from the same illness that claimed her mother. The rancher's eyes, dulled by grief and sleepless nights, scanned the darkening landscape. He knew the signs: the way the horses grew restless in their stalls, the manner in which the remaining cattle huddled together near the water trough, the eerie silence that preceded nature's most violent displays. This storm would be different from the others, carrying with it a cold that could freeze the blood in a person's veins. From the shadows of the pine forest that bordered his property, a figure emerged on horseback. The rider moved with the fluid grace of one born to the saddle, his silhouette cutting through the gathering dusk like a blade through silk. Even at a distance, Thomas could discern the distinctive bearing of a tribal warrior, the straight spine, the easy communion between man and horse, the way he seemed to read the very soul of the approaching storm. The warrior's mount, a paint stallion with markings that resembled war paint across its chest and flanks, picked its way carefully across the rocky terrain. Steam rose from the animal's nostrils in the cooling air, and its ears swiveled constantly, alert to dangers both seen and unseen. The rider himself wore traditional buckskins adorned with intricate beadwork that caught the last rays of sunlight, and his long black hair was braided with strips of leather and small bones that spoke of victories earned and honors bestowed. As the warrior drew closer, Thomas could see the man's face, angular features carved by wind and sun, eyes that held the depth of ancient wisdom, and a mouth set in a line that suggested both determination and compassion. This was no random traveler seeking shelter from the storm. The warrior's presence here at this moment carried the weight of purpose. The rancher's thoughts turned to his daughter, who lay in her bed upstairs, her breathing shallow and labored. The fever had returned 3 days ago, bringing with it the familiar pallor and weakness that had nearly claimed her life once before. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away in good weather, and the approaching storm would make such a journey impossible. Thomas had spent the afternoon preparing for what he feared might be his daughter's final night, gathering blankets and stoking the fire, all while knowing that his efforts might not be enough. The warrior's horse came to a stop at the edge of the property, just beyond the broken gate that had once marked the boundary between civilization and the wild. For a long moment, man and rider remained motionless, as if weighing invisible scales of fate and necessity. The wind picked up, sending tumbleweeds skittering across the yard and rattling the loose boards of the barn. In the distance, lightning flickered within the storm clouds, followed by the low rumble of thunder that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth. The temperature had already begun to drop, and Thomas could see his breath forming small clouds in the air. Soon, the storm would be upon them, bringing with it a cold that could kill as surely as any blade or bullet. The warrior's gaze moved from the approaching tempest to the house, where the warm glow of lamplight spoke of human habitation and vulnerability. His trained eye took in the signs of recent hardship, the neglected repairs, the empty animal pens, the general air of a place where hope had been tested and found wanting. Yet there was something else in his assessment, a recognition of the love that still dwelt within those walls, fragile but enduring. As the first fat snowflakes began to fall, carried on the leading edge of the storm, the warrior urged his horse forward. The paint stallion responded immediately, its hooves striking the frozen ground with the rhythm of an ancient drum. Whatever had brought this man to this place on this night was about to unfold with the inexorable force of the approaching blizzard. The warrior dismounted, with the fluid grace of water flowing over stone, his moccasined feet touching the frozen earth without sound. His paint stallion stood perfectly still, trained through years of partnership to remain motionless, even as the wind began to howl with increasing ferocity around them. Snowflakes, large and heavy with moisture, settled on the warrior's broad shoulders and disappeared into the dark fabric of his buckskin shirt. Thomas Whitmore descended the porch steps slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that leaned against the doorframe. Yet something in the warrior's bearing, the open palms, the respectful distance he maintained, the way his eyes held no trace of aggression, caused the rancher to pause. This man had not come as an enemy. The tribal warrior's name was Ayana, though few white men had ever learned to pronounce it correctly. In his native tongue, it meant eternal blossom, a name given to him by his grandmother, who had seen in his infant eyes the promise of one who would bring healing rather than destruction. Now, at 32 winters, he had fulfilled that prophecy in ways that transcended the boundaries between his people and the settlers who had claimed these lands. Ayana's keen gaze swept over the homestead, reading the story written in its weathered boards and broken fences. He saw the marks of recent loss, the way certain tasks had been left undone, the absence of a woman's touch in the garden where frost-killed flowers still clung to their stems, the general air of a man struggling alone against forces greater than himself. But it was not these obvious signs that had drawn him here through the gathering storm. 3 days ago, while hunting in the high country, Ayana had experienced a vision that came to him as he sat in meditation beside a sacred spring. In the vision, he had seen a young woman with hair the color of autumn wheat, her spirit flickering like a candle flame in a strong wind. The vision had shown him this very homestead, and with it came an understanding that transcended rational thought. Someone here would die before the next sunrise, unless intervention came from an unexpected source. The warrior carried with him a leather pouch that had belonged to his grandmother, a medicine woman whose knowledge of healing herbs and sacred rituals had been legendary among their people. Inside the pouch were roots and leaves gathered from secret places in the mountains, each one blessed according to traditions that stretched back through countless generations. But more than the physical medicines, Ayana carried within himself the gift that had made his grandmother's reputation, the ability to see beyond the veil that separated the world of the living from the realm of spirits. As he approached the house, Ayana could sense the presence of illness within its walls. It hung in the air like a dark cloud, invisible to ordinary sight, but as real to him as the approaching storm. The fever that burned within the young woman upstairs was not merely a physical ailment. It was a spiritual battle between the forces that sought to claim her and those that fought to keep her tethered to the world of the living. Thomas watched the warrior's approach with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. The man's reputation had reached even this isolated corner of the territory. Stories were told in hushed voices around campfires and in trading posts, tales of miraculous healings, of children snatched back from the very threshold of death, of wounds that closed without scarring under the warrior's ministrations. Some dismissed these stories as superstition, but Thomas had lived long enough on the frontier to know that survival often depended on accepting help from unexpected sources. The wind picked up dramatically, sending loose snow swirling around the two men like ghostly dancers. The temperature continued to plummet, and Thomas could feel the cold seeping through his wool coat and into his bones. Inside the house, he knew that Sarah lay beneath every blanket he could find, yet still she shivered with a cold that seemed to come from within rather than without. Ayana stopped at the base of the porch steps, his dark eyes meeting those of the rancher. In that moment of silent communication, understanding passed between them, the acknowledgement of a father's desperation, the recognition of a healer's purpose, and the mutual awareness that time was running short. The warrior's presence here was no coincidence. It was the answer to prayers that Thomas had been afraid to voice aloud. The storm clouds overhead had grown so thick that they blotted out the last traces of daylight, plunging the homestead into an early twilight that spoke of the long, brutal night ahead. Lightning flickered within the clouds, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. This was more than weather. It was nature's way of marking a moment when destinies would be decided and lives would hang in the balance. Ayana's hand moved to the medicine pouch at his side, his fingers tracing the familiar patterns of beadwork that decorated its surface. The time for hesitation had passed. The interior of the Whitmore homestead bore the unmistakable marks of a household touched by tragedy and sustained by stubborn love. Ayana's moccasined feet crossed the threshold into a world where the scent of wood smoke mingled with the lingering fragrance of dried herbs that hung in bundles from the kitchen rafters. The main room, lit by the warm glow of oil lamps, revealed furniture crafted by careful hands, a rocking chair worn smooth by years of use, a dining table scarred by the daily rituals of family life, and photographs in simple frames that captured moments of happiness now preserved only in silver and memory. Thomas led the way up the narrow staircase, each creaking step echoing through the house like a drumbeat marking time. The rancher's shoulders, once broad and confident, now carried the weight of sleepless nights and helpless vigil. Behind him, Ayana moved with the silent grace of his people, his keen senses already attuned to the spiritual currents that flowed through this place of sickness and sorrow. The upstairs hallway stretched before them, its walls lined with more photographs, and a sampler embroidered with words of faith that seemed to mock the current circumstances. At the far end, a door stood slightly ajar, and from beyond it came the sound that had haunted Thomas for 3 days, the labored breathing of his daughter as she fought a battle that seemed increasingly hopeless. Sarah Whitmore lay beneath a mountain of quilts and blankets, her face pale as winter moonlight against the dark fabric of her nightgown. At 17, she possessed the delicate beauty of her late mother, but illness had carved hollows beneath her cheekbones and painted dark circles under eyes that remained closed in fevered sleep. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle that seemed to require more effort than the last. Ayana approached the bedside with the reverence of one entering a sacred space. His trained eye took in the signs that spoke of a spirit preparing to depart, the bluish tinge to her fingernails, the way her chest rose and fell with increasing irregularity, the subtle changes in her aura that were invisible to untrained sight, but clear as daylight to one who had walked between worlds since childhood. The warrior's weathered hands moved to the leather pouch at his side, withdrawing items that seemed ordinary, yet carried within them the accumulated wisdom of generations. A bundle of sage, its silver-green leaves dried to perfection, would cleanse the spiritual atmosphere of the room. Roots of echinacea and willow bark, gathered under specific moon phases, would address the physical manifestations of her illness, but most important was a small crystal pendant that had belonged to his grandmother, a piece of clear quartz that seemed to capture and hold the lamplight within its faceted depths. Thomas stood in the doorway, his hands clenched at his sides as he watched the warrior begin his preparations. The rancher's rational mind, shaped by years of practical frontier living, warred with the desperate hope that had taken root in his heart. He had seen too much death in his 43 years, cattle lost to harsh winters, neighbors claimed by accidents and disease, and most recently, his beloved wife taken by the same fever that now threatened their daughter. Yet something in the warrior's calm confidence suggested possibilities that lay beyond the reach of conventional medicine. The storm outside had reached its full fury, with wind that howled like the voices of the damned, and snow that struck the windows with the force of thrown pebbles. The house shuddered under the assault, its timbers groaning in protest against the elements. Inside Sarah's room, the lamplight flickered with each gust, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move with purpose and intent. Ayana began to arrange his medicines on the small table beside the bed, each item placed with ceremonial precision. The sage was bound with sinew into a tight bundle, ready to be lit when the proper moment arrived. The healing roots were ground into fine powder, using a mortar and pestle carved from sacred stone. The crystal pendant was suspended from a leather cord, positioned so that it would catch and reflect the lamplight directly onto Sarah's fevered brow. As the warrior worked, the very air in the room seemed to change, becoming charged with an energy that transcended the physical world. The boundary between life and death, always thin in places where suffering dwelt, grew thinner still. The sacred smoke began to rise as Ayana touched flame to the bundle of sage, its silver tendrils curling upward in patterns that seemed to follow invisible currents in the air. The herb's distinctive fragrance filled the small room, carrying with it the essence of high mountain meadows and ancient ceremonies performed under starlit skies. Thomas watched from the doorway as the warrior moved the smoking bundle in precise circles around his daughter's bed, each gesture deliberate and meaningful in ways that transcended his understanding. Sarah's breathing had grown more labored in the past hour, her chest rising and falling with the irregular rhythm of one whose spirit was being pulled between worlds. Her skin, once flushed with fever, had taken on a translucent quality that spoke of life ebbing like water from a cracked vessel. The quilts that covered her seemed to rise and fall of their own accord, as if moved by winds that existed only in the realm between sleeping and waking. Ayana's movements around the bed followed patterns taught to him by his grandmother, a woman who had been born in the time when his people still roamed freely across the vast plains. She had shown him how to read the signs written in smoke and shadow, how to interpret the language of spirits that spoke in whispers only the initiated could hear. Now, as he performed the cleansing ritual, he could sense the presence of those who had gone before, ancestors who watched from beyond the veil, waiting to guide Sarah's spirit to whatever destiny awaited her. The warrior's keen perception detected something else in the room, a darkness that clung to the corners like cobwebs and seemed to feed on the young woman's weakening life force. This was more than mere illness. It was a spiritual malady that had taken root in the aftermath of her mother's death. Grief, left untended, had become a poison that slowly consumed her from within, making her vulnerable to the fever that now threatened to claim her completely. Outside, the storm raged with unprecedented fury, as if nature itself was responding to the cosmic struggle taking place within the modest homestead. Lightning split the sky with increasing frequency, each flash illuminating the swirling snow in stark relief, before plunging the world back into darkness. The wind howled around the house like a living thing, seeking entry through every crack and crevice, carrying with it the bone-deep cold that could freeze the soul as surely as the body. Thomas found himself remembering his wife's final days, how she had fought the same fever with the same desperate courage that Sarah now displayed. Margaret had been the heart of their home, the gentle force that had transformed a rough frontier dwelling into a place of warmth and love. Her death had left a void that seemed to grow larger with each passing day, and Thomas now understood that his daughter had been slowly disappearing into that same emptiness. Ayana completed the cleansing ritual and set the sage bundle aside, its work done for the moment. He then turned his attention to the crystal pendant, lifting it carefully from the table and holding it up to catch the lamplight. The quartz seemed to come alive in his hands, its faceted surface breaking the light into rainbow fragments that danced across the walls like tiny spirits celebrating their freedom. The warrior placed the pendant gently on Sarah's forehead, positioning it at the point where his grandmother had taught him the soul resided. The crystal's cool surface seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and for a moment, the young woman's breathing appeared to steady. Her eyelids fluttered as if she were trying to wake from a dream that held her in its grip, and a soft sigh escaped her lips. Thomas stepped closer to the bed, his heart hammering with a mixture of hope and fear. He could see something changing in his daughter's face, a subtle shift in the quality of her stillness that suggested the presence of forces beyond his comprehension. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls were waiting for some cosmic decision to be rendered. Ayana began to prepare the herbal medicine, grinding the sacred roots into a fine powder that would be mixed with water drawn from a spring blessed by his people's ceremonies. Each ingredient had been gathered according to ancient protocols, harvested at specific times, when the moon and stars aligned to maximize their healing properties. The warrior's hands moved with practiced precision, measuring and mixing according to formulas passed down through generations of healers. The storm outside reached a crescendo of fury, and in that moment of nature's greatest violence, something shifted in the delicate balance between life and death. The herbal mixture transformed into something that seemed to glow with its own inner light as Ayana stirred it, with a carved bone spoon that had belonged to 7 generations of healers before him. The liquid took on a golden hue that reminded Thomas of honey touched by sunlight, and its aroma carried hints of mountain springs and wildflower meadows that bloomed far above the tree line. Steam rose from the cup in spirals that seemed to form shapes and symbols before dissolving back into formless vapor. Sarah's condition had reached a critical juncture. Her breathing had become so shallow that Thomas found himself leaning forward to detect any movement of her chest beneath the heavy quilts. Her skin had taken on an almost ethereal quality, as if she were already beginning to fade from the physical world into something more insubstantial. The fever that had burned within her for days now seemed to have consumed everything it could find, leaving behind only the faintest spark of life. Ayana lifted the young woman's head with infinite gentleness, supporting her neck with one hand while bringing the cup to her lips with the other. The sacred medicine flowed between her parted lips in tiny sips, each drop carrying with it the concentrated essence of healing plants that had grown in soil blessed by countless ceremonies. Some of the liquid ran down her chin, but enough found its way into her system to begin the work that conventional medicine could never accomplish. The warrior's grandmother had taught him that true healing required more than herbs and rituals. It demanded a willingness to journey into the realm of spirits and negotiate directly with the forces that governed life and death. As he administered the medicine, Ayana felt his consciousness begin to shift, sliding away from the physical world and into the twilight realm where souls wandered when they stood at the crossroads between existence and eternity. In this altered state of awareness, the room around him took on a different quality. The walls seemed to breathe with their own rhythm, and the lamplight cast shadows that moved independently of their sources. Thomas appeared as a figure wrapped in layers of grief and desperation, his aura dark with the weight of impending loss. But it was Sarah who commanded Ayana's attention, for around her slight form swirled energies that spoke of a spirit caught between two worlds. The warrior could see her as she truly was in this moment, not merely a sick young woman, but a soul standing at the edge of a vast chasm that separated the land of the living from the realm of the ancestors. On the far side of that chasm, a figure waited with arms outstretched in welcome. Even in the spirit realm, Ayana recognized the woman as Sarah's mother, her face radiant with the peace that came to those who had completed their earthly journey. Margaret Whitmore's spirit called to her daughter with a love that transcended death itself, offering the comfort of reunion and the promise of an end to all suffering. It was this call that had been slowly drawing Sarah away from the world of the living, weakening her resistance to the fever and making her vulnerable to the spiritual malady that fed on grief and loneliness. But Ayana also perceived another presence in the spirit realm, a darker entity that sought to claim Sarah not out of love, but from hunger for the life force that still flickered within her. This shadow being had attached itself to the young woman during her mother's final illness, feeding on her sorrow and growing stronger with each passing day. It was this parasitic spirit that had made her susceptible to the fever, using her physical weakness as a gateway to consume her soul. The warrior understood now why his vision had brought him to this place on this night. The battle for Sarah's life was not merely medical, it was a cosmic struggle between forces of light and darkness, love and hunger, healing and destruction. His role was not simply to administer medicine, but to serve as a guardian and guide for a soul that had lost its way in the labyrinth between worlds. Thunder crashed overhead with such violence that the entire house shook, and in that moment of earthly chaos, Ayana made his choice. Drawing upon power inherited from generations of spiritual warriors, he stepped fully into the realm of spirits, leaving his physical body seated beside Sarah's bed, while his consciousness journeyed into the place where her fate would be decided. The crystal pendant on Sarah's forehead began to pulse with increasing intensity, its light growing brighter with each heartbeat as the true battle commenced. In the spirit realm, Ayana found himself standing on a vast plain that stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface covered with grass that shimmered like silver in the light of a moon that hung impossibly large in the star-filled sky. This was the place between worlds, where souls journeyed when they prepared to cross from one existence to another. The air itself seemed alive with energy, crackling with the power of transformation and the weight of cosmic decisions that would echo through eternity. Sarah's spirit stood at the center of this ethereal landscape, her form translucent and wavering like heat rising from summer pavement. She appeared as she had been before illness claimed her, vibrant and beautiful, with hair that caught the moonlight and eyes that held the promise of dreams yet to be fulfilled. But around her swirled the dark tendrils of the shadow entity, coiling about her like smoke given malevolent purpose, seeking to drag her consciousness into the void where lost souls wandered without hope of redemption. The parasitic spirit had grown strong during its months of feeding on Sarah's grief and despair. It manifested as a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, its form constantly shifting between recognizable shapes and abstract horror. Sometimes it appeared as a twisted version of her mother, using Margaret's face to whisper promises of eternal reunion. Other times it took the form of her own reflection, distorted by self-doubt and the crushing weight of survivor's guilt that had plagued her since her mother's death. Margaret Whitmore's true spirit stood on the far side of the chasm that separated the living from the dead, her presence radiating the pure love of a mother who had never truly left her child's side. She beckoned to Sarah with gentle gestures, offering the peace that came with release from earthly suffering, but her call was one of invitation, not compulsion. She would welcome her daughter, if that was Sarah's choice, but she would not force the decision upon her. Ayana stepped forward into this cosmic drama, his spirit form clothed in the regalia of his ancestors, war paint that told the story of his lineage, feathers that had been blessed in ceremonies older than memory, and weapons forged not of steel, but of pure intention and righteous purpose. He carried with him the accumulated power of 7 generations of healers, each one adding their strength to his own, as he prepared to face the darkness that sought to claim an innocent soul. The shadow entity sensed his presence immediately, turning its attention from Sarah to this new threat that dared to interfere with its feast. It reared up like a serpent preparing to strike, its form expanding until it towered over the spirit plane, like a thundercloud pregnant with malevolent lightning. The creature's voice, when it spoke, was the sound of wind through graveyards and the whisper of dying breath, a cacophony of despair that sought to break the will of any who opposed it. But Ayana had been trained for this moment since childhood, taught by his grandmother, to navigate the treacherous currents of the spirit world and stand firm against entities that fed on human suffering. He began to chant in the ancient language of his people, words that had been spoken in ceremonies for countless generations, syllables that carried within them the power to bind darkness and call forth light. The crystal pendant, still resting on Sarah's physical forehead in the world above, began to pulse in rhythm with his chanting, its light growing brighter with each repetition of the sacred words. The connection between the spirit realm and the physical world strengthened, allowing Ayana to draw upon the healing energies that flowed through the earth itself, the life force that connected all living things in an endless web of existence. Sarah's spirit began to respond to the warrior's presence, her form becoming more solid and defined as the shadow entity's hold on her weakened. For the first time since entering this realm between worlds, she seemed to truly see where she was and understand the choice that lay before her. Her gaze moved from her mother's loving face to the darkness that had been slowly consuming her, and finally to Ayana, who stood as a guardian between her and the forces that sought her destruction. The battle that followed was not one of physical violence, but of spiritual will and cosmic purpose. Ayana called upon the power of his ancestors, feeling their strength flow through him as he confronted the shadow entity with weapons forged of pure intention. Light blazed from his spirit form, pushing back the darkness that had seemed so overwhelming moments before. The creature writhed and twisted, seeking escape from the cleansing fire that threatened to unmake its very existence. In the physical world, Thomas watched in amazement as the crystal pendant on his daughter's forehead blazed with light so intense it seemed to illuminate the entire room. Sarah's breathing, which had been growing weaker by the moment, suddenly steadied and deepened. Color began to return to her pale cheeks, and her eyelids fluttered as if she were awakening from a long and troubled dream. The storm outside reached its peak fury, as if nature itself was responding to the cosmic battle being fought in the realm beyond mortal perception. The shadow entity's defeat came not through violence, but through the overwhelming power of love and sacrifice that Ayana channeled from the collective strength of his ancestors. As the creature's dark form began to dissolve under the assault of pure light, it released its hold on Sarah's spirit with a sound like wind escaping from a broken vessel. The parasitic being that had fed on her grief and despair crumbled into nothingness, its malevolent essence scattered to the cosmic winds where it could no longer harm the innocent. Sarah's spirit stood free for the first time in months, her form now radiant with the natural light that belonged to all living souls. The silver grass of the spirit plane seemed to bend toward her, as if recognizing the return of one who had been lost, but was now found. Her mother's spirit smiled from across the chasm, an expression of pure maternal joy that conveyed both blessing and farewell. Margaret's presence began to fade, not in sorrow but in the peaceful knowledge that her daughter had chosen life over the easy escape of death. Ayana felt the pull of the physical world calling him back, his consciousness sliding away from the spirit realm like water, flowing downhill toward its natural destination. The transition was gentle but profound, carrying with it the satisfaction of a sacred duty fulfilled and a life preserved against overwhelming odds. As his awareness returned to Sarah's bedroom, he found himself looking upon a scene transformed by the miracle of spiritual healing. The young woman's breathing had become deep and regular, her chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of natural sleep rather than the labored gasps of one fighting for each breath. The deathly pallor that had marked her features was giving way to the healthy flush of returning vitality, and her lips, which had been blue with oxygen deprivation, now showed the pink of restored circulation. The crystal pendant on her forehead continued to glow softly, its light gradually dimming as the immediate crisis passed. Thomas stood transfixed beside the bed, his weathered face wet with tears of relief and wonder. The transformation he was witnessing defied everything he thought he knew about the nature of illness and recovery. His daughter, who had been at death's door mere hours ago, now appeared to be sleeping peacefully, her body already beginning the process of healing that would restore her to full health. Outside, the storm that had raged with such fury throughout the night was finally beginning to abate. The wind still howled around the house, but with less violence than before, and the lightning that had split the sky with such frequency now came in sporadic flashes that seemed more like nature's way of celebrating than expressing wrath. Snow continued to fall, but the flakes were smaller now, drifting down with the gentle persistence of a winter that would be harsh but survivable. Ayana carefully removed the crystal pendant from Sarah's forehead, wrapping it in a piece of soft leather before returning it to his medicine pouch. The sacred stone had served its purpose, acting as a conduit between the physical and spiritual worlds during the crucial moments when her fate hung in the balance. Now it would rest until another soul required its healing power. The warrior gathered his remaining medicines with the same ceremonial care he had used in their preparation. Each item returned to its proper place within the leather pouch that had belonged to his grandmother. The sage bundle, now reduced to ash, was collected and would later be scattered to the four winds as an offering of gratitude to the spirits who had aided in Sarah's healing. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with the first pale hints of morning light, Ayana knew that his work here was complete. The young woman would recover fully, her spirit now free from the darkness that had nearly claimed her. The fever would break within hours, and with it would come the return of strength and the promise of a future filled with possibilities. The first rays of dawn broke through the dissipating storm clouds, like golden arrows piercing a dark tapestry, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape that surrounded the Whitmore homestead. The blizzard that had threatened to claim everything in its path was retreating toward the distant mountains, leaving behind a world transformed by winter's touch but not conquered by its fury. Icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves of the house, and the bare branches of the cottonwoods were encased in shells of ice that caught and reflected the morning light in countless tiny rainbows. Sarah's recovery had progressed with the same miraculous speed that had marked her healing throughout the night. Her fever had broken just as the storm began to weaken, and now she slept the deep, restorative sleep of one whose body was rebuilding itself from the cellular level upward. Her breathing was strong and even. Her skin had regained its natural warmth and color, and the terrible stillness that had marked her approach to death had been replaced by the subtle movements of someone lost in peaceful dreams. Thomas sat in the chair beside her bed, his vigil finally transformed from desperate watch to grateful guardianship. The rancher's face showed the toll that the night's events had taken. Deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes, stubble that spoke of days without proper rest, and the slightly dazed expression of a man who had witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. Yet beneath the weariness was a profound sense of relief and gratitude that seemed to emanate from his very soul. Ayana stood at the bedroom window, watching the sun climb higher into a sky that was clearing with each passing moment. His work here was finished, but he felt no urgency to depart. The warrior understood that healing was not merely about driving away illness. It was about restoring balance to lives that had been thrown into chaos by forces beyond their control. The Whitmore family would need time to adjust to their new reality, to understand that the darkness which had threatened to consume them had been banished forever. The homestead itself seemed to reflect the transformation that had taken place within its walls. Where yesterday there had been an air of impending doom, now there was a sense of renewal and possibility. The lamplight that had flickered uncertainly throughout the night now burned steady and bright, and the very walls seemed to exhale the tension that had built up during the long months of grief and fear. Even the photographs on the walls appeared different, their subjects no longer trapped in moments of the past, but serving as bridges between what had been and what could yet be. As the morning progressed, Sarah began to stir, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness slowly returned. When she finally opened her eyes, they were clear and bright, free from the fever-induced confusion that had clouded them for days. She looked first at her father, whose face broke into a smile of pure joy at seeing her truly awake for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Then her gaze moved to Ayana, and in her expression was a recognition that transcended ordinary understanding. She knew, without being told, that this man had saved her life. The warrior approached the bed and gently placed his hand on Sarah's forehead, feeling the normal warmth of healthy skin where once there had been the burning heat of fever. Her pulse, when he checked it at her wrist, was strong and regular, and her breathing showed no trace of the labored quality that had marked her illness. The healing was complete, not just of her body, but of her spirit, which had been freed from the grief and despair that had made her vulnerable to the forces of darkness. Thomas rose from his chair and moved to stand beside Ayana. The two men united in their shared experience of the miraculous. The rancher's hand found the warrior's shoulder, a gesture that conveyed gratitude beyond the power of words to express. In that moment, the barriers of culture and race that might have separated them in other circumstances seemed as insubstantial as morning mist before the rising sun. Outside, the world was awakening to a new day. Birds that had taken shelter during the storm began to emerge from their hiding places, their songs creating a symphony of life that celebrated the return of peace. The snow that covered the ground would melt in time, revealing the earth beneath that waited patiently for spring's return. And in the distance, barely visible through the clearing air, smoke rose from other homesteads where families were beginning their daily routines, unaware of the miracle that had taken place in their midst. Thank you for joining us for another Indigenous Love Stories journey. If this story made your heart beat a little faster, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments which part touched you the most. Every gesture helps carry these tales of love, courage, and hope even further. Until our next ride.